Professor of genetics in the University of Chicago. I have come to regard him, since the sad death of John Maynard Smith, as the principal guru to go to on evolutionary genetics in the world. And it's a very great pleasure to introduce Jerry Coyne to speak today.
Thanks. It is a shame, it is embarrassing to me as a United States American to say that the acceptance of angels in my country, and I'm not just talking as metaphorical angels, these are literal winged beings, is accepted by 63% of Americans, whereas acceptance of evolution, if you're generous, is 47% or 15%. Angels, hell, heaven, it all runs about 63 to 70% in the US. Darwin, in the scientific view, about 15%. This is shameful.
It's inherent in the scientific method of using the best evidence you can that you're sometimes going to have evidence that you've missed or you interpreted things wrongly. That said, there are some things that we found out in science that are not going to change, which theists and other critics of science don't seem to realize. Like DNA is going to be a double helix 2,000 years from now. There's not going to be no discovery that changes that. Our closest living relative is the chimpanzee. I can't imagine that changing. The formula of water is H2O. So science sometimes hits on things that we would consider absolute truths by almost any standard. Absolute truths in the sense that Anthony Grayling uses, that you would bet your house on there being unchangeable things. So when people claim that science is a dubious practice because it's sometimes wrong, they're ignoring all the things that are right and have been right for hundreds of years and are very unlikely to change.
We have evidence up to the Big Bang. We don't have any evidence for layered. And so you can say that there might be layers and the explanation might be richer because that's what you want it to be richer, but that doesn't mean that that layer is really there in the first place. Second of all, I've just mentioned, I guess John didn't hear it, that science can test the supernatural. We don't rule out supernatural causes from the beginning in science. That's a misunderstanding. We have discarded them over time because they have not proven necessary. Every test of whether the supernatural exists has shown that it doesn't. ESP, intercessory prayer, etc. It's that ruling out of God that has led many of us philosophically to say, well, we can't see it over and over again, we have to discard it.
Some of the best evidence for evolution in the fossil record are found from marine microfossils, which are these tiny planktonic organisms that live in the sea. And why they're so good for evolution is, first of all, they usually have hard skeletons. Second of all, when they die, they just fall to the bottom, automatically ensuring that they lie in the sediments. The sediments cover them up and preserve them. And you can get these whole groups of them, organisms. You can take a time slice of a single lineage of these organisms by simply drilling a core through the seafloor and then slicing that core into pieces, dating them, and following the lineage and how it looks and seeing how it changes. And here's one of them, a very simple organism. It's a diatom, a marine protist with a calcareous skeleton. And we can see that over the 1.7 million year slice of time, on the left here, and this is one characteristic of that, which is the size of the thing, an aspect of its size, that we see some evolutionary change happening. Sometimes it gets smaller, sometimes it gets bigger, smaller, bigger. Evolution doesn't always have to be unidirectional. There's no God propelling this. It's the environment, and the environment changes. So we see evolution here, but more important in this case, if we follow the core down, we see this as well, that we see the instant at which one lineage divides into two. That's not so easy in the fossil record, given the difficulty of fossilization. But in marine microfossils, it's easy. And lo and behold, what do we see? Evolution and speciation. And this lineage itself evolves, becoming smaller over the 1.5 million years that it exists. Okay, and I could give you case after case after case. I mean, if you're a creationist, you'd tell me, so what? These are just diatoms. Give me something interesting like a mammal and show me evolution in that. Okay, so here's a mammal. This is the horse. We have a really good fossil record of the horse, most of whose evolution took place in North America. Horses form a branching bush, just like many organisms do. There's no single lineage of horse, but if you follow some lineages, you see evolutionary change. One famous lineage is the one that goes from this common ancestor, Hyracotherium, a cute little animal about this big, evolving into the modern horse, and you see all kinds of evolutionary changes occurring on that lineage. It loses its toes, starts off with 5 toes, the 2 outer ones disappear, then the 2 middle ones disappear, and you're left with 1 toe left. It's an example of evolution. That's for creation. So I'll proceed now to my main argument. I have to define my terms. What do I mean by science? What do I mean by religion? What do I mean by them being incompatible? And to do this, I'll also tell you what I don't mean by them being incompatible. Science, well, you could construe science in any number of ways. You could say it's what I do when I go to work. It's what Larry Krauss does when he goes to work, the profession of professional scientists. You could construe it as the body of knowledge that is produced by science, that is the knowledge which is constantly, of course, changing, You could construe it as the fruits of science as technology, but I construe it, and I think that's the most sensible way, as something that doesn't really change. And that is, it's a methodology for finding out what's true about the universe. Most of you know how scientists work. There's a body of us. We check each other's results. The guiding feeling of a scientist is doubt and questioning. When you sit in a seminar by another scientist, you're always trying to think, what the hell is wrong with what he's saying? How can I show this person to be a moron? And it took me a long time to get used to that mindset, but then I realized that is the way the field moves forward, through doubt and questioning. And that's, of course, why we're all atheists. As conclusions change in results, the falsified hypothesis, we have to make predictions. We have to test those predictions. We have to test our theories against nature, and if nature doesn't support them, we have to throw them into the dustbin of good ideas that didn't pan out. Our truths are all provisional. I think the sort of best definition of science that has ever been put forward, or at least the rationale for doing science, is by Richard Feynman, the physicist. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So you have to be very careful about that. In other words, science is a very elaborate and formalized schema of behavior and attitudes that prevent you from trying to say what is true, trying to say what would like to be true is true. It's a way of preventing you from fooling yourself. Religion, of course, is exactly the opposite of that. It's a highly developed schema to make you think that what comforts you really is true. So that's a real difference in methodology between science and religion. What is religion? This is a sticky wicket by anybody. I mean, how do you define religion when there are so many types of belief systems in the world? I'm just going to give one that corresponds to what most of us think of as religion, the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. I will fob this one off on Dan Dennett, since it's his definition for breaking the spell, but I think it's as good as any. Social systems whose participants avow belief in a supernatural agent or agents whose approval is to be sought. Okay, I think it's a theistic religion. And it comes with two other accoutrements. First of all, that you usually have a personal relationship with the deity, if you're a worshiper of these kinds of religions. And second of all, and this is the dangerous part, it almost always comes with a code of conduct. That is, that the deity wants you to behave in a specific way, and you are to behave in this specific way. In other words, these kinds of religions come attached to a morality. Okay. And of course, there are other things that you could call religion, like Buddhism. Is that a religion? Is Jainism a religion? I'm not going to argue about that, because where this debate really goes on is in countries that have Abrahamic religions. Okay? Religion is not based on empirical observation. It's not based on doubt. It's not based on inquiring your hypotheses against nature. It's based on dogma, authority, revelation, scripture, and faith, which I think was defined by Walter Kaufmann, the best definition of faith: intense, usually confident belief that is not based on evidence that is sufficient to command assent from every reasonable person. Peter Brughassian would say it more curtly as pretending to believe what you know is not true, or what you don't think is true. But faith is basically belief in the absence of substantial evidence, although some religious people will adduce weak evidence for their belief.
I don't think the supernatural is outside the natural realm. I think many people misunderstand supernatural as something that's not possibly to be investigated by science. The natural means can't be brought to discover. I'll give you two examples of how scientists have tried to investigate the supernatural. Intercessory prayer. If you pray for somebody, do they get better faster? You can do this with Indians when they do rain dances to bring rain. You could test that. You could see if ESP works. There's any number, because John is a theist, like many religious people, and thinks that God interacts with the world in direct, empirically observable, testable ways. If you make that claim, then the mechanisms of science can be brought into. I mean, you could see if people could be born from virgins, or that they could come back after being dead for 3 days. You could see if there's only 2 humans in the history of the world. Now, some of those claims are beyond our ability to investigate because they're supposedly only happened once. But things like the Great Flood, evolution, and Noah's Ark, and Adam and Eve, those are claims about supernatural. And they've been investigated by science and refuted. So I really don't like the word supernatural. I like the word divine, that there's something beyond the physical world that can influence the physical world. Now, if you're a deist and you think that there's just some power that set the whole thing in motion, took the hands off, then there's really no way that we can investigate that as scientists. But most religious people are not deists, they're theists. They think that God actually does something, and those things that God does are perforce within the ambit of scientific investigation.
You know, lots of preachers will claim, or even sophisticated theologians claim that, you know, they are making statements about the natural world, but the way they adjudicate the way they adjudicate those claims differs from the way science does it. They have insulated their claims from disconfirmation. That's the way it is. They have an explanation for everything. So if you find something that claims to invalidate a religious claim, like evolution did in 1859, they can always adjust their theology to accommodate it. Or if you say that, you know, well, like just God, we were talking about this earlier, wouldn't give children leukemia. Well, they'll make up some, you know, reason why God would do that. But of course, they're just making stuff up. And so, and different religions make up different things. So they have all these incompatible claims. So in the end, they're doing exactly what you don't do in science, which is insulating what you want to believe from being disconfirmed by somebody else. So, I mean, the basic claim is that they both make empirical claims. Religion, of course, makes other claims about morality and communality, but I'm just talking about existence claims. And they differ in the outcomes of those claims, that science can actually show things to be true, whereas I would claim that theology has not hit upon any verifiable fact about the natural or supernatural in thousands of years. We don't know anything more about God than the ancient Greeks did. They differ in outcomes, they differ in methodologies. Science has this method of rigorous epistemic testing of your claims, and they sort of differ in philosophy. We talked yesterday about philosophical naturalism. Science has a philosophy where you do not include invocation of the supernatural unless it becomes absolutely necessary to do so. And at one time it did. Newton couldn't figure out why the planetary orbits were stable, so he said, well, God must keep them stable. That was a time when science really could invoke the supernatural as a way of explaining something you couldn't, but then.
But it was a mistake.
It was a mistake.
We didn't have enough information.
Yeah. And so that's why we reject the supernatural. Now, it's not, and I should correct this for anybody that's watching. A lot of people, including my advisor Dick Lewington, say that science, from the outset, refuses to consider the supernatural. He's made a famous statement, which is trumpeted by all the creationists. We cannot allow a supernatural foot in the door. From the outset, we're hidebound naturalists, and that makes us look narrow-minded.
Yeah.
Because if the God exists and it's not beyond possibility, logical possibility that a deity exists, then how can you say that, it's like being an atheist and saying, I know God doesn't exist. Being a scientist saying, I know the supernatural doesn't exist, and so therefore we're not going to consider it. Well, that's not the way it really works. The reason we exclude the supernatural these days from science is because it's never proven to help us understand anything. I mean, Newton had an explanation based on supernatural things, but it was explained naturally.
Was it Laplace, I think it was?
Laplace, his famous book. The story may be apocryphal,
right.
but
I had no need of that hypothesis.
And certainly today we know why the planetary orbits are stable, and it's a purely naturalistic explanation. Diseases, epilepsy, as you know, was once thought to be a manifestation of demons, and we know now it's electrical impulses in the brain. So one by one, we've had to reject all the incursions of the supernatural from science. And so now it's just not useful to consider God when you're doing science. Just saying, well, this experiment didn't work because God didn't like me that day or something. So it's not that we rule it out of court from the beginning. It's that it has not been helpful at all. And this has led ultimately to the view of, philosophical naturalism. That's called methodological naturalism when you don't really consider the supernatural. Philosophical naturalism, I think, is the natural outcome of that, which is, if you reject supernatural intervention over and over and over again because it hasn't been helpful, you start to think, well, maybe there isn't anything supernatural. And then that becomes philosophical naturalism, which many people adhere to, which is the view that there doesn't seem to be any supernatural forces at work
that the
in the world.
natural is all there is.
Yeah, all there is. So.